Hi, I'm Rob.
And I'm Rob.
And this is Ask Rob and Rob.
Welcome to Ask Rob and Rob. It's another week of answering your property questions. It works pretty well as long as you send your questions in. So if you do have something on your mind and you'd love to know an answer, the way to get it across to us and to get on the show is so easy.
It certainly is. It's all in one safe place. And that is the Property Hub website. Go to propertyhub.net/ask and you can get your question in there. There's a few ways you can do it, and you can even get your question to appear in the Sunday Times as well. Now, that's very exciting, but what is more exciting is that we have a question to answer right here, right now. And that first question is in from Elliott.
Hi, Rob and Rob. It's Elliott here from West Lancashire, so not too far from Rob B's neck of the woods in Liverpool. I'm in the process, or hopefully going to be in the process, of purchasing my first buy-to-let property over the coming months. It's something I've been planning for and immersing myself in over the last 12 months, part of which was kickstarted with my purchase and reading of Rob D's Complete Guide to Property Investment. And since then, the Property Podcast and Ask Rob and Rob series have almost become religious listening every week. So I really appreciate all the content you put out, and in particular the videos as well. My question is around capital growth and rental yield, or ROI, or however you choose to calculate your rental profits. And it's around the fact that they often, or they seem to be generally accepted to be at opposite ends of the spectrum. So you either have a property that yields very well, or you have a property with likely potential for lots of capital growth, or you have something in the middle. The notion of having a high yield or high ROI rental property that also has real opportunity for high capital growth appears to be non-existent, or, you know, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. And I suppose my question is, why? I've never really seen any specific article on this. There's people seem to have touched on it, or I can read between the lines. And of course, I appreciate that value, the actual cost, initial cost of a property plays a part. But still, I'm interested. Why does a property that doesn't necessarily yield very well, or won't necessarily give you a massive amount of ROI in terms of that rental cash flow and initial profits, have real opportunity for long-term capital growth? And that's where your real ROI comes, i.e. the southeast. And yet properties that will give you a really strong ROI in those initial from rental profits, i.e. the northeast, don't necessarily have strong capital growth. Yeah, I'd be really interested just to sort of a quick overview as to why that is really. Really appreciate your support, and any help you've got will be much appreciated. Thank you.
Hey, Elliott, thank you for your question. I'm glad that the podcast is a regular part of your schedule. Now, let's answer this question for you. You're right, it's not really talked about much, but there is a reasonably simple explanation for this. And that is that areas that have strong capital growth, or the potential for strong capital growth, have probably already had strong capital growth. People are naming areas that have traditionally done well, like London, for example. London has done very well for capital growth, and I think most people know that over time London has done exceptionally well. And most people, I'm sure, would say that over the long term in the future, London will probably do very well. But yields are really poor in London, really, really poor. And the simple reason for that is because it has done so well in terms of capital growth. Prices have gone up so much, but rent hasn't gone up as nearly as much. So rent generally over the long term matches inflation, but property prices outdo inflation, and certain places like London have really outperformed inflation over the long term. Obviously year by year is different, but this is all over the long term. So over time, the distance between the two, the yields and the values of those properties has been stretched, and therefore the return that you get is less. And areas like the northeast of England, which has seen nowhere near as much capital growth, or put in another way, see property prices that are a lot lower, means that the yields are more attractive because it hasn't outperformed inflation as much. Now, does that mean the nirvana of both taking place in the same property investment does not exist? No. You can occasionally, and I mean it's super, super rare, but you can sometimes find properties that yield quite well, but are considered strong prospects for capital growth. I've seen it with high-end properties, for example. And possibly the reason for that, although I can't prove it, is that if you go to a area where you go for a property that's a bit unique, it's high end, it stands out from what else is in those areas, then maybe because it is in short supply, you can attract the stronger yields. I'll give you a real life example. I personally have an apartment in Manchester that has 3 bedrooms in a very high end development. And the capital growth, it's done very well. But rent-wise, it's done very well also. And that's probably for 2 reasons. One, the rental demand in Manchester has been super strong because of lack of supply. But also, it's such a unique type of property, it being really, really high-end, one of the best blocks within the whole city, and having a unique profile. Having a 3-bed apartment is different. It's rare. There's not as many of them. So I think that is why it fell into that weird sweet spot of having both. But I have to tell you, most of my portfolio has been a choice. Early on, most of them yielded well, and that was really because I could only afford the lower priced properties. But as I've talked about on the podcast previously, my strategy has moved to higher end properties, and they don't yield as well. And I'm okay with that because I realise the real wealth in property is made over the long term through capital growth. And I see the rent, because I don't need it to pay me today, I see the rent as a bonus. So I might be willing to accept a 4% ROI versus a 6% ROI if I have a strong belief that the 4% is going to outperform in the long term for capital growth. So there you have it, Elliott. Hopefully the answer that you've been searching for. And yet the hope that that magic type of property does exist. But my super final word of warning is, if you're listening to this and going, right, I'm only ever going to invest in those properties, don't, because you could go years without investing. They are super rare, and you cost yourself by doing nothing more than sitting back and waiting for the perfect deal.
Wise words. Let's see what we can do now for Sophia.
Hey, Rob and Rob, this is Sophia here. I'm based in East London. I recently discovered your podcast and have been listening to it pretty much non-stop for the past week or two, so thanks for putting all that material together. I've recently taken the plunge from working full-time and having property as my side hustle to ditching my full-time job and just focusing entirely on property. I currently own 3 properties, including my residential property, which I unfortunately purchased in my own name. I'm about halfway towards getting a deposit together for a 4th property, which I will now be putting into a limited company. My question for you guys is, if I'm buying a property in a limited company, is there any other way that I can get financing for the property besides just getting my own savings? Anyway, thanks again for all your work.
Thank you for your question, and well done for getting up to 3 properties. That in itself is no mean feat, and you're already ahead of almost everyone else. I think it's very easy to get a warped perception, but you are already winning in a big way. Of course, though, you want to go faster. Everyone wants to go faster, and so it's natural to look for other forms of financing. The bad news is that buying in a limited company doesn't really make any difference. So the way to think about a limited company in the context of property is as a tax wrapper. You can still obtain lending in the normal way, so you can borrow up to around about 75% of the property's value if everything stacks up, but the lender is still going to be looking primarily at you, or more accurately at the company's directors, rather than the company itself. And there aren't really any other entities who are going to be willing to lend additional sources of funds to that company because, again, it's just a wrapper. The company will have the property assets within it, but those property assets, of course, already have debt against them. And there's no particular motivation for anyone to lend more in the same way as you'd struggle to get additional lending against a property that you owned personally, where you'd already maxed out your primary borrowing. So I wish there was a more complete answer. I wish there were more complexities for you, but that's kind of the state of it. Buying your next property in a company, I assume, is the right thing for you to do for other reasons. I assume that you've spoken to an accountant about it and verified that that's the right move, because you should have done. And that's great. It's really important to be buying future properties in the structure that makes sense for you. But it doesn't change anything when it comes to your financing. So it's still going to be a case of saving up. But hopefully, with your savings plus the rental income that's coming in from your other properties, it won't take you too long to get there.
And it won't be too long before we're back, because we're going to be back on Thursday with the Property Podcast. And of course, back same time, same place, your podcast feed, with another Ask on Tuesday. So until then, take care, have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.